Did you enjoy giving up the house so easily, Mom? The question came from my son, casual, almost amused, as he swirled the ice in his glass like we were discussing the weather. I blinked at him. The house. I asked, what are you talking about? For a brief second, the room shifted. Not physically, but something in the air tightened, like a thread pulled too far. Across the table, my daughter-in-law slowly looked up from her plate. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The faint curve of her lips told me everything I didn't yet understand. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're listening from. I have a feeling this story travels further than I ever did. Because what happened that afternoon didn't just take my home. It showed me something far worse. It showed me who my family really was. The dining room looked exactly the way I had arranged it that morning. Polished oak table. 8 chairs, though only 4 of us had shown up. White linen napkins folded neatly beside each plate. The good china, the one I only used for holidays, laid out with care. I had even taken out the silverware my husband, Thomas, bought on our 25th anniversary. It felt important to use it today. I suppose I thought, if everything looked right, maybe everything would be right. At 72, you start to believe in small illusions like that. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, casting long, golden streaks across the table. Dust floated in the air, visible only when the light caught it just right. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Almost. David sat at the head of the table now. My son, 45 years old. Successful. Confident. A man who built a life I used to be so proud of. Used to. Beside him sat Claire, his wife of 10 years. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. Perfect timing in everything she said and didn't say. She had always been that way. Careful. Measured. Watching. I used to mistake that for grace. Now I wasn't so sure. I thought the paperwork went smoothly. David continued, glancing at Claire briefly before looking back at me. You didn't have any issues, did you? Paperwork. The word landed heavier than it should have. I frowned slightly. David, I haven't signed anything recently. What paperwork are you talking about? There it was. Again. That shift. Claire set her fork down with a soft, deliberate clink. Not loud enough to draw attention, but loud enough that I noticed. You don't remember? She asked gently, tilting her head just enough to appear concerned. I searched her face. There was something off about her expression. Too composed. Too prepared. I think I would remember signing away my house, I replied, keeping my tone even. Silence stretched across the table. Not awkward. Not confused. Calculated. David leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose like he was trying to stay patient. Mom, he said, slower now. The transfer documents. The ones you signed last month. For the property. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The wood felt colder than it should have. I didn't sign any transfer documents, I said. And this time I was sure. Absolutely sure. Because that house wasn't just a property. It was 38 years of my life. It was the kitchen where I burned my first Thanksgiving turkey and Thomas laughed until he cried. It was the living room where David took his first steps, wobbling toward me with those tiny, determined hands. It was the bedroom where I held my husband's hand as he took his last breath. You don't forget signing something like that away. You don't misplace a memory like that. David's jaw tightened. Claire's fingers laced together neatly in front of her. And suddenly, I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't confused. They weren't mistaken. They were waiting. Waiting for me to agree. Waiting for me to play the part they had already written. You told me you wanted something simpler, David continued, his voice carrying a hint of frustration now. You said the house was too much to manage after Dad passed. I stared at him. I said it was quiet. I corrected. Not that I wanted to give it away. Another pause. Longer this time. Claire finally leaned forward, her voice soft, almost soothing. We just want what's best for you, she said. That house is a lot for someone your age. The maintenance alone, I've managed it for nearly 4 decades, I interrupted. My voice didn't rise, but something in it changed. Even I could hear it. A shift. A line, quietly drawn. Claire smiled again. But this time, it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, she said. But things change. Yes, they do. And in that moment, sitting at that table I had set with my own hands, surrounded by the people I had given everything to, I felt it. That subtle, undeniable crack beneath the surface. Like ice beginning to give way. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. The way he avoided holding my gaze for too long. The way his fingers tapped against the glass. The way he kept glancing at Claire, as if checking for approval. And then I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. One I had somehow been part of, without ever knowing it. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. Careful, controlled, because if I moved too quickly, I wasn't sure what might spill out. When exactly do you think I signed these documents? I asked. David hesitated. Just for a second. About a month ago, he said. You met with the lawyer. Claire arranged everything to make it easier for you. Easier. The word echoed in my mind. Claire's gaze remained steady on me now. Watching. Measuring. Waiting. I nodded slowly, as if I were following along. As if I believed them. But inside, something else was happening. Something colder. Quieter. More dangerous than anger. Because anger is loud. This was not. This was clarity. The kind that comes when every piece finally starts to fall into place. I thought back over the past few weeks. The phone calls I didn't quite remember. The afternoon Claire insisted on helping me organize paperwork. The envelope she said just needed a quick signature so the bank wouldn't delay things. I had trusted her. Of course I had. She was family, wasn't she? I felt a faint smile touch my lips. Not because anything was funny, but because, for the first time, I was seeing the full picture. And it was so much worse than I had imagined. They hadn't just taken advantage of me. They had counted on me. Counted on my trust. My grief. My age. I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip, giving myself a moment to steady my thoughts. Neither of them spoke. They were waiting. Still waiting. For me to agree. To surrender. To make it easy. I set the glass down gently. The sound was soft. But in the silence of that room, it carried. I see, I said. And I meant it. Because I did see now. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that whatever they thought they had done, whatever they believed they had secured, this wasn't over. Not even close. I met Claire's eyes. Held them. For just a second longer than she expected. And something flickered there. Just briefly. Something uncertain. Good. Let her feel that. Because for the first time since this conversation began, I wasn't the one in the dark anymore. And what I would do next was something they never saw coming. The house felt different that night. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. I stood in the kitchen long after they left, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter. The same counter where I had prepared thousands of meals. The same surface worn smooth from years of quiet routines. Dinner plates still sat in the sink. Untouched. I hadn't had the appetite to eat. The silence pressed in around me, thick and unfamiliar. It hadn't always been like this. After Thomas passed, the house had been quiet, yes, but not empty. There's a difference. Quiet still carries presence. Memories. Warmth. Echoes of something that once was. Empty. Empty feels like something has been taken. I exhaled slowly and reached for the faucet, turning it on just enough to break the stillness. The sound of running water filled the room, soft but steady. Grounding. For the first time since that conversation at the table, I allowed myself to think clearly. Not react. Not feel. Just think. Because something about today didn't sit right. No, not just something. Everything. I dried my hands and walked slowly into the living room. The lamp beside the armchair was still on, casting a warm pool of light over the space Thomas used to sit every evening. His book was still there. I hadn't moved it. Couldn't. I lowered myself into the chair across from it and looked around. Every object in that room told a story. The framed photographs on the mantel. David at age 6, missing his front tooth, grinning like he owned the world. David at 16, holding his first car keys, his eyes bright with excitement. David on his wedding day, standing beside Claire, smiling. I studied that last photo a little longer than the others. Even then, there was something in her expression I couldn't quite name. Not unkind. Not cold. Just distant. As if she had already calculated where she stood in the room, and where everyone else would stand around her. I leaned back slowly, the weight of the day settling deeper into my chest. About a month ago, David had said. I repeated the words quietly to myself. A month. I closed my eyes, retracing the days. The small details. Because it's never the big moments that betray you. It's the small ones. The ones you don't question. The ones you trust. Claire visiting more often than usual. Always with a reason. Helping me sort through bills. Organizing files. just to make things easier for you. I remembered the afternoon she brought over that folder. Neatly labeled. Tabs in place. Everything arranged so carefully it felt almost thoughtful. There are just a few things we need to update, she had said, setting it down in front of me. I hadn't thought twice. Why would I? She had always been efficient. Responsible. The kind of woman who handled things. And I had been tired that day. More tired than I wanted to admit. Grief does that. It dulls your edges. Makes you slower. Softer. Easier. I remember sitting at this very table, the same one from dinner today, flipping through pages I didn't fully read. Legal terms. Bank details. Signatures required. Just routine updates. Claire had assured me, her voice calm, reassuring. I had nodded. Picked up the pen. Signed where she pointed. Once. Twice. 3 times. I opened my eyes slowly. The room felt colder now. Not physically, but something inside me had shifted again. They hadn't forced anything. They hadn't argued. They hadn't even raised their voices. No, they had simply guided me, step by step, until I walked exactly where they wanted me to go. I let out a quiet breath, my fingers tightening slightly against the armrest. And David, my son, he had been there that day, not sitting beside me, not watching closely, but present, in the background, in the silence. I tried to remember if he had said anything at all, but the harder I searched, the more I realized something that settled heavily in my chest. He hadn't stopped it. Not once. I stood up, slowly, and walked toward the hallway. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if I were walking through something fragile, something that might crack if I moved too quickly. My bedroom door was slightly open. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. The bed neatly made, the curtains half drawn, Thomas's watch resting on the dresser. I picked it up gently, turning it over in my hand. He used to wind it every night before bed. Said he liked the ritual. Said it reminded him that time was something you took care of, not something you wasted. I swallowed quietly and set the watch back down. They think I'm slowing down, I murmured under my breath. They think I won't notice. The words didn't carry anger. Not yet. Just recognition. Clarity. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap. For a long moment, I didn't move. Didn't think. Just listened. To the silence. To the house. To myself. Because beneath everything else, beneath the confusion, the hurt, the quiet betrayal that was only just beginning to take shape, there was something else. Something steady. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. Not over them. Not yet. But over myself. And that was enough. For now. I lifted my head slightly, my gaze settling on the doorway. On the hallway beyond it. On the rest of the house. My house. At least. For the moment. They believe this is already done, I said softly. They believe I've already given it all away. A faint smile touched my lips. Small. Controlled. Gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Let them. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this. They had made their move. Quietly. Carefully. Confidently. And they thought I hadn't even noticed. But they were wrong. I had noticed. And what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that I wasn't finished. Not even close. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had slept well, but because I hadn't. Sleep had come in short, shallow waves. Never deep enough to rest. Never long enough to forget. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For years, I used to wake up to the sound of Thomas moving around downstairs. The faint clink of a coffee mug. The soft shuffle of his slippers across the kitchen floor. Now, there was nothing. Just silence. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. Like the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I sat up slowly, my joints protesting just enough to remind me of my age. 72. Not young. Not as quick as I used to be. But not helpless. Not confused. Not finished. I got dressed without rushing. A simple sweater, slacks, the same ones I wore when I had errands to run. Nothing unusual. That was important. Because today wasn't about reacting. It was about observing. I moved through the house the way I always did. Turning on lights, opening curtains, letting the morning sun spill into each room. Everything looked the same. Exactly the same. And yet, it wasn't. I paused in the hallway, my gaze drifting toward the small desk where I kept my paperwork. Neat stacks. Labeled folders. The system I had built over decades. Slowly, I walked over and pulled out the top drawer. Inside, Everything appeared untouched. Bills, bank statements, insurance documents, all in their place, carefully arranged. Too carefully. I reached for the folder Claire had brought over a few weeks ago. It was still there, exactly where I had left it. My fingers hovered over it for a moment before I picked it up. The weight of it felt different now. Not heavier, just clearer. I carried it to the dining table and sat down in the same chair I had used the day before. The same seat where I had signed papers without reading them, without questioning, without knowing. I opened the folder, page by page, slowly this time, deliberately. No distractions, no trusting voices guiding me along. Just me and the truth. Legal language filled the pages, dense, precise, designed to be understood only by those who knew what to look for. But I didn't rush. I didn't skim. I read every word, every line, every clause, and little by little, it started to come together. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. The first few documents were harmless. Bank authorizations, access permissions, routine adjustments, exactly the kind of things Claire had said they were. But then, about halfway through, I saw it. A title. Short, simple, easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Property transfer agreement. My hand stilled against the page. I read it once, then again, slower, carefully. And this time, I didn't just read the words. I understood them. The house, my house, the one Thomas and I built our life in, had been legally transferred. Not sold, not shared, transferred. Ownership reassigned. To David. With full authority granted immediately upon execution. Execution. Such a clean word. Such a quiet word. For something that felt like it had just cut straight through the center of my life. I exhaled slowly, setting the paper down. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't quicken. If anything, I felt calmer than I had the night before. Because confusion had a weight to it. And now, that weight was gone. Replaced by something sharper. Something steadier. Understanding. I continued reading. There were signatures. Mine. Clear. Undeniable. Placed exactly where they needed to be. Exactly where Claire had pointed. I studied them for a moment. The way the ink pressed into the paper. The way my name curved at the end. There was no doubt. No trick. No forgery. I had signed it. Willingly. Just not knowingly. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle. They didn't steal it. I said quietly to myself. They had me give it to them. That was the difference. And somehow, that made it worse. Because it meant this wasn't rushed. Wasn't desperate. Wasn't accidental. This had been planned. Carefully. Patiently. Step by step. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it. For a long moment, I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just sat there. Letting the truth sit with me. Not fighting it. Not denying it. Just accepting it. Because you can't respond to something you refuse to see. And now, I saw everything. The visits. The helpful tone. The perfectly timed conversations. Even yesterday's dinner. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't concern. That was confirmation. They had already won. Or at least, they thought they had. I stood up slowly and carried the folder back to the desk. Placed it exactly where it had been. Closed the drawer. Everything returned to its place. Exactly as before. Because nothing had changed. Not on the outside. And that was exactly how I needed it to stay. For now, I turned and walked back into the kitchen, reaching for the coffee pot. The routine felt grounding. Familiar. Safe. I poured myself a cup and stood by the window, looking out at the yard. The garden Thomas had planted years ago was still there. Roses just beginning to bloom. He used to say they needed patience. Time. Care. They don't bloom overnight, he would tell me. But when they do, it's worth the wait. I took a small sip of coffee, the warmth settling slowly into my chest. Patience. Yes, that was something I still had. More than they realized. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was this. Rushing would only help them. Reacting would only confirm what they believed. That I was confused. That I was weak. That I didn't understand what had happened. But I did understand. Perfectly. And because of that, I had something they didn't. Time. I set the cup down gently on the counter. They made their move, I said softly. My gaze remained steady on the garden outside. And now, a pause. Small. Measured. It's my turn. And this time, I wouldn't sign anything. I wouldn't trust anything. I wouldn't say anything. Until I was ready. Because the next move I made wouldn't just stop the room cold. It would change everything. I didn't call anyone that day. Not my son. Not a lawyer. Not even a friend. Because the moment you let something like this leave your control, you lose the advantage. And right now, control was the only thing I had. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I paid attention. To the details. To the silence. To the spaces between what people said and what they avoided. 2 days passed. Quietly. Deliberately. I followed my routines the way I always had. Morning coffee by the window. A short walk down the street. Folding laundry that no one else would ever notice. From the outside, nothing had changed. And that was exactly what I wanted. Because people reveal the most when they think everything is settled. On the third day, David called. I let it ring twice before answering. Not immediately. Not too late. Just enough. Hi, Mom, he said, his voice careful. How are you feeling? Feeling. I almost smiled at the word. I'm fine, I replied. Why wouldn't I be? A pause. Short. Measured. I just wanted to check in, he said. After the other day. The other day? I repeated lightly. You mean dinner? Yes. Another pause. He was choosing his words. That told me everything. I thought everything was clear, he added. Clear. Such an interesting choice. Yes, I said calmly. It is. Silence again. Longer this time. Because that wasn't the answer he expected. He wanted confusion. Questions. Maybe even resistance. But clarity? That made him uncomfortable. Good, he said finally. That's good. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before speaking again. When do you plan to move in? I asked. I kept my tone neutral. Almost curious. Like a simple, practical question. But on the other end, something shifted. What do you mean, he asked. The house, I said. It's yours now, isn't it? There it was. The truth. Said plainly. No accusation. No emotion. Just fact. Another pause. This one longer. He hadn't expected me to say it like that. Well, we haven't decided yet, he replied. We thought it might be easier if you stayed there for now. Of course. Easier. Always easier. For you or for me? I asked. My voice didn't change. But the question lingered. Sharp. David exhaled quietly. Mom, let's not make this complicated. I looked out the window as he spoke. The roses had opened a little more. Slowly. Exactly as they were supposed to. I'm not, I said. I'm just trying to understand. And I was. Just not in the way he thought. After the call ended, I stood there for a long time. The phone still in my hand. Not because I was upset, but because I was listening. To the echo of his words. To the hesitation. To the things he didn't say. They weren't ready to take the house. Not yet. Which meant one thing. They needed me there. For now. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I drove. Not far. Just across town. To a place I knew well. A small office building with faded brick walls and a narrow parking lot. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Not because I was unsure, but because I was choosing my timing. Choosing my next step. Carefully. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Familiar. Steady. The kind of place where things were written down. Recorded. Made real. Can I help you? The receptionist asked with a polite smile. Yes, I said, returning it gently. I'd like to review some documents. She nodded, asking for my name. I gave it. Watched as she typed it into the system. Waited. Calm. Because this wasn't about reacting anymore. This was about confirming. About seeing exactly how far they had gone. And how much they thought they could take. A few minutes later, I was led into a small office. Simple desk. 2 chairs. A stack of files waiting neatly at the edge. I sat down slowly, placing my hands in my lap. The same way I had at my own table. But this time, I wasn't being guided. I wasn't being rushed. And I wasn't signing anything. The man across from me adjusted his glasses and opened the file. Mrs. Carter, he said, you requested copies of the recent transfer documents? Yes, I replied. My voice was steady, clear. He slid the papers across the desk. The same documents I had read at home. But now, they looked different. Not because the words had changed, but because the context had. These were executed about 4 weeks ago, he continued. Everything appears to be in order. In order. I almost nodded. Because from the outside, it was perfectly arranged. Carefully done. Legally sound. That was the problem. I rested my hand lightly on the top page. I see, I said. And I did. More clearly than ever. Because this wasn't just about trust. Or betrayal. This was about strategy. They hadn't made a mistake. They had made a plan. And plans can be undone. but only if you understand them first. I looked up at him. Tell me something, I said calmly. If someone signs something they don't fully understand, I paused. Just long enough. Does that always mean it can't be questioned? He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Because hesitation means possibility, and possibility was all I needed. When I walked out of that office, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because anything had been fixed, but because something had opened. A door. A path. A way forward. I got back into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. Still. Steady. Focused. They think it's over, I said quietly. My reflection in the windshield looked back at me. Not confused. Not broken. Just awake. They think. I've already lost. A small pause. Then a breath. Slow. Controlled. But they forgot something. My fingers tightened slightly around the wheel. Not in anger. In certainty. I built everything they're trying to take. And people like me don't lose everything without knowing exactly how to take it back. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove slowly through the neighborhood. Not because I had somewhere else to be, but because I needed to see things clearly. From the outside, the streets hadn't changed. Same sidewalks. Same trimmed hedges. Same houses standing quietly in their places, holding years of other people's lives behind closed doors. I passed by the park where David used to play as a boy. I remembered sitting on a wooden bench, watching him run across the grass, his laughter carrying farther than I thought possible. Back then, everything felt simple. You give, you protect, you build, and one day, you believe it will come back to you. I slowed the car as I turned onto my street. My house came into view. White siding, blue shutters. The porch Thomas painted himself one summer afternoon, refusing to let anyone help him. It has to be done right, he said. I parked in the driveway but didn't get out immediately. Just sat there, looking at it. Really looking. Because now, I wasn't seeing it as a home. I was seeing it the way they did. An asset. A transfer. A completed transaction. They reduced it to paper, I said quietly, and expected me to become part of the paperwork. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Each step steady, measured, like I was entering a place I already knew, but no longer trusted. Inside, everything was still, exactly as I left it. The air held that same quiet weight. But now, I understood it. This wasn't just silence. This was space. Space they thought they had already taken control of. I set my keys down and walked straight to the desk. Opened the drawer. Took out the folder again. This time, I didn't sit. I stood, flipping through the pages with a different kind of focus. Not searching for shock anymore. Not looking for proof. I already had that. Now, I was looking for patterns. Dates. Signatures. Witness names. Legal references. Small details most people ignore. But details are where plans reveal themselves. And Claire. She had planned this carefully. I could see it now. The timing of the visits. The order of the documents. The way everything was structured to look routine. Nothing rushed. Nothing obvious. Which meant she didn't just want the house. She wanted it clean. Undisputed. Final. I stopped at one page. A witness signature. Not mine. Not David's. Someone else. A name I didn't recognize. I read it twice. Then once more. Because this was something. Not a mistake. But a thread. And threads, when you pull them slowly enough, they start to unravel everything. I closed the folder and placed it back in the drawer. Carefully. Exactly as before. Because nothing leaves its place until the moment it matters. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened Thomas's old study. The room still smelled faintly of leather and paper. His chair sat by the window. Desk untouched. Everything preserved exactly the way he left it. I walked in slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the bookshelf. He used to keep everything organized. Not just documents, but information. Notes. Records. He believed in keeping track of things. Memory fades, he used to say, but paper remembers. I sat down at his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and there it was. A small locked box. Simple. Dark wood. The kind that doesn't draw attention, but holds things that matter. I reached into the side compartment and took out the key. I hadn't used it in years. Didn't need to. Until now. The lock clicked softly. Inside. Folders. Old ones. Neatly labeled in Thomas's handwriting. Insurance. Property. Legal. Everything tied to the house. To our life. To what we built. I pulled one out. Opened it. And began to read. This time, The documents were different. Older. Original. Clear. No soft language. No rearranged terms. Just facts. Ownership. Structure. Protection. Thomas had always been careful. More careful than I realized. Because as I turned each page, I started to see something else. Something Claire hadn't counted on. There were clauses. Conditions. Details tied to the property that went beyond simple ownership. Things that required more than just a signature to override. Things that couldn't be quietly erased. I leaned back slowly, the paper resting in my hands. They thought I didn't know what I had. I murmured. And maybe. I didn't. A pause. Small. Quiet. Until now. I closed the folder and placed it gently on the desk. Not rushed. Not careless. Because this wasn't just information. This was leverage. The room felt different now. Not heavy. Not silent. But steady. Grounded. Like something had shifted back into place. I stood up and walked toward the door, pausing just before stepping out. My hand rested lightly against the frame. For a moment, I said nothing. Did nothing. Just stood there. Thinking. Connecting. Understanding. They made one mistake, I said softly. Not angry. Not bitter. Just certain. They assumed I had nothing left. I glanced back at the desk. At the open path in front of me. At everything they had overlooked. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I wasn't just observing. I was preparing. Because whatever came next wouldn't be quiet. Wouldn't be accidental. And it wouldn't be something they could smile their way through. I turned off the light and closed the door behind me. Softly. Deliberately. They wanted everything. I whispered into the empty hallway. A faint pause. Then, they should have made sure I had nothing left to use. Because now, I did. And I was going to use it. I didn't rush into anything the next day. Because once you see the truth, the worst thing you can do is move too fast. Instead, I waited. And I watched. That afternoon, Claire came over. Unannounced. Of course. She always preferred it that way. No warning. No time to prepare. Control the timing, control the situation. I heard her heels before I saw her. Soft, precise steps across the front porch. Then the doorbell. One press. Not impatient. Just certain. I opened the door. She smiled. Warm. Polished. Exactly the same smile she wore the day she handed me those papers. Hi, she said gently. I was in the area and thought I'd check on you. In the area. I nodded, stepping aside. Of course, I replied. Come in. She walked in like she belonged there. Not hesitant. Not careful. Just comfortable. Her eyes moved quickly across the room. Not obvious. But I noticed. She wasn't looking at memories. She was assessing space. Ownership. You've kept everything so nice, she said, placing her bag down. It must be a lot to manage on your own. There it was again. That tone. Soft concern, hiding something sharper. I manage, I said simply. And I did. We moved into the kitchen. I offered coffee. She accepted. Of course she did. Claire never refused anything that gave her time to observe. I poured 2 cups. Set one in front of her. Then sat down across the table. The same table. The same place. But this time, I wasn't the one being guided. She wrapped her hands lightly around the cup. Didn't drink. Just held it. I spoke to David, she said. He told me you seemed upset after dinner. Upset. I almost smiled. I wasn't upset, I replied. I let the words sit there. Clear. Simple. Unemotional. That made her pause. Just slightly. Oh, she said. Well, that's good. A beat. Then, we just want to make sure you're comfortable with everything. Comfortable. Another careful word. I nodded slowly. I am, I said. And this time, I meant it differently. Her fingers tightened just a little around the cup. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. Because she was waiting for something. Resistance. Questions. Doubt. Anything she could use. But I gave her none of it. Instead, I leaned back slightly and asked, who was the witness? The question landed softly. But it cut straight through everything. Claire didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flickered. Just for a second. Then she smiled again. Calm. Controlled. Oh, just someone from the office, she said. Standard procedure. Standard. Procedure. I nodded. Do you remember their name? Another pause. Longer this time. That's usually handled by the legal team, she replied. It's not something we focus on. Interesting. I picked up my cup. Took a slow sip. Let the silence stretch just enough. Then, I saw the documents, I said. No accusation. No emotion. Just fact. This time, She didn't hide the reaction. Not completely. Her shoulders stiffened. Her smile didn't disappear. But it changed. Less relaxed. More calculated. Of course, she said. You have every right to review them. Yes, I replied. I do. We sat there for a moment. Neither of us speaking. But everything was being said. Because now, she knew. Not everything. But enough. Enough to understand that I wasn't as unaware as she thought. You know, she said carefully. These things can feel overwhelming. Legal language, contracts, it's easy to misunderstand. Misunderstand. There it was. The narrative. Gently placed. Ready to be used. If needed. I set my cup down. Looked at her. Held her gaze. And for the first time, I let a small piece of truth show. I understood more than you think, I said. Quiet. Even. Final. The room shifted. Not visibly. But something in her posture changed. Less relaxed. More alert. Then you know everything was done properly, she replied. Not a question. A statement. Carefully placed. Yes, I said. Another pause. Then, very properly. Her eyes searched my face. Looking for something. Cracks. Emotion. Anything. But I gave her nothing. Because the moment you show them what you know, they adjust. They close doors. They cover tracks. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I stood up slowly. Walked to the sink. Rinsed my cup. Simple movements. Ordinary. Behind me, I could feel her watching. Thinking. Recalculating. Claire, I said, without turning around. Yes. Her voice was steady again. Careful. You've always been very organized. A compliment. On the surface. I try to be, she said lightly. I nodded. Still facing the sink. Thomas used to be the same way. A pause. Then, he kept copies of everything. Silence. I turned slightly, just enough to see her reaction. It was small, but it was there. That flicker again. That moment where control slips, just a little. That's good, she said. It's important to stay organized. Yes, I replied. It is. I dried my hand slowly, turned back toward her. And this time, I smiled. Not warm. Not cold. Just steady. Because sometimes, I continued, the original documents tell a different story than the new ones. That did it. Not a dramatic reaction. Not panic. Claire was too controlled for that. But something shifted. Deep. Immediate. She stood up. Too quickly for someone who had just been sitting comfortably. Well, she said, smoothing her blouse. I should get going. I just wanted to check on you. Of course. I walked her to the door. Same as always. Same routine. Thank you for stopping by, I said. Polite. Composed. Of course, she replied. But her voice was different now. Tighter. Less certain. She stepped outside. Paused. Then turned back. Let us know if you need anything. I nodded. I will. The door closed softly behind her. And just like that, the balance had shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Because now she knew, I wasn't confused. I wasn't passive. And I wasn't finished. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the door, listening to her footsteps fade, to the quiet returning. They're starting to feel it, I said softly. Not fear. Not yet. But pressure. And pressure, when applied slowly, cracks even the strongest plans. I turned back into the house. Calm. Focused. Certain. Because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. This was about timing. And when the moment came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't need to argue. I wouldn't need to fight. I would just say one sentence. And this time, they would understand exactly what it meant. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read. I didn't even make tea. I just sat in the living room and let the silence settle. There's a moment after something shifts, when everything becomes clearer. Not louder. Not more dramatic. Just sharper. Claire's reaction stayed with me. Not what she said, but what she didn't. The hesitation. The way she stood up too quickly. The way her voice tightened just slightly at the end. People like her don't lose control easily. Which means, when they do, even for a second, it matters. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes resting on the photograph across the room. David, 6 years old, covered in dirt, holding a broken toy truck like it was something precious. He used to come running to me when something broke. Not to hide it. Not to fix it himself. Just to show me. Because he trusted me to make it right. I closed my eyes briefly. That boy wouldn't have done this, I said quietly. And I meant it. Because somewhere along the way, something changed. But this wasn't about who he used to be. It was about who he had become. And more importantly, who was guiding him now? The next morning, I made another decision. Not emotional, not reactive, strategic. I called someone. Not a lawyer. Not yet. Someone else. Someone who didn't belong to David or Claire's world. Good morning, a familiar voice answered. Hello, Margaret, I said. It's been a while. There was a brief pause. Then warmth. Genuine. Not practiced. Evelyn. Oh my goodness, it has been a while. Are you all right? Margaret had known me for over 20 years. She used to work with Thomas. Handled some of our financial records back when everything was still being built. Before things became simplified. Before Claire. I'm fine, I said. I just had a question. Of course, she replied. What do you need? I didn't explain everything. Not yet. You don't reveal the full picture until you know who you're speaking to. Instead, I asked carefully. Do you remember the original structure of the property documents? The way Thomas set things up. Silence. Not hesitation. Recognition. Yes, she said slowly. I do. Good. Were there any conditions tied to transfer? I asked. Another pause. This one longer. Evelyn, she said gently. Those documents weren't simple ownership papers. I didn't respond. Just listened. There were protective clauses, she continued. Thomas was very specific about them. Especially after certain concerns came up years ago. Concerns. I knew exactly what she meant. He didn't want the property to be moved or reassigned without full awareness, she added. Not just legally, but mentally. He insisted on clear consent. Clear consent. I repeated the word silently. And if that condition isn't met? I asked. Margaret didn't answer immediately. But when she did, her voice had changed. Less casual. More precise. Then it can be challenged, she said. I didn't speak. Didn't react. Just let the words settle. Because this was the piece I needed. But it depends on how everything was executed, she added. Details matter. Timing. Witnesses. Documentation. Details. Yes, I had those. Or at least, I was starting to. Thank you, I said. Simple. Sincere. Evelyn, she continued carefully. Is there something you want to tell me? I paused. Looked out the window. The roses were fully open now. Soft. Bright. Patient. Not yet, I said. But there will be. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time. Not thinking. Not planning. Just understanding. Because now, everything connected. The original documents. The witness I didn't recognize. The way Claire handled everything so cleanly. Too clean. And clean sometimes means fragile. I stood up and walked back to Thomas's study. Opened the door. Turned on the light. The room greeted me the same way it always had. Quiet. Orderly. Unchanged. I went straight to the desk. Opened the folder I had found the night before. And this time, I wasn't just reading. I was comparing. Old documents. New documents. Line by line. Word by word. And there it was. Not obvious. Not dramatic. But clear. Something was missing. A clause. A condition. One that should have been there. But wasn't. I leaned back slowly, my fingers resting lightly against the paper. They removed it, I said quietly. Not guessed. Not assumed. Known. Which meant one thing. The transfer wasn't just guided. It was altered. Carefully. Intentionally. I closed the folder. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough. They didn't just use me, I murmured. They changed the rules. And that was different. Because using trust is one thing. But altering protection? That leaves a mark. I stood up and walked toward the window. The sunlight filled the room, warm against my face. But I didn't move. Didn't blink. They think this is done, I said softly. They think the paper is final. A pause. Then, they're wrong. Because paper can be rewritten, challenged, exposed. But only if you know where to look. And now, I did. I turned away from the window, my mind clear. Focused. Steady. The next step wasn't about gathering information anymore. It was about positioning. Setting the stage. Because when the moment came, when everyone was in the same room again, when they believed everything was settled, I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't explain. I would just say one sentence. And this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. They wouldn't be able to smile through it. Because this time, that sentence would carry the truth they tried to erase. I didn't call David. And he didn't call me. That silence. It wasn't distance. It was strategy. Because now, both sides understood something had changed. Not openly. Not in words. But in the space between us. They were waiting. Watching. Trying to decide what I knew. how much I knew, and what I would do with it. And I was doing the same. 3 days later, the invitation came. Not directly. Of course not. Claire sent it. Family dinner this Sunday, her message read. Just something small. We'd love for you to come. Love. Such an easy word. I stared at the message for a moment, then set the phone down. Didn't answer right away, because timing still mattered. A family dinner. After everything. After the documents. After the silence. No, this wasn't just dinner. This was positioning. They wanted everyone in one place. Controlled environment. Familiar setting. They wanted to see how I would act. Whether I would question. Whether I would resist. Whether I would comply. I picked up the phone again. Typed slowly. Carefully. I'll be there. Short. Neutral. No emotion. Exactly what they expected. That afternoon, I began preparing. Not for dinner. For the moment. I went back into Thomas's study. Closed the door behind me. Sat at the desk. The documents were already laid out. Old and new. Side by side. This time, I didn't read them again. I already knew what they said. Instead, I organized them. Original property agreement. Protective clause. Witness requirements. Then, transfer documents. Missing clause. Unknown witness. Simple. Clear. Undeniable. I placed them into a single folder. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just enough. Because truth doesn't need volume. It needs precision. I closed the folder and rested my hand on top of it. This ends with one sentence, I said quietly. Not a plan. A certainty. Because everything else was already done. The next day, I drove into town again. Not to the legal office this time. Somewhere else. A small print shop. Quiet. Almost empty. Can I help you? The man behind the counter asked. Yes, I said. I need copies. I handed him the documents. Watched as he placed them into the machine. Page by page. The sound of copying filled the room. Steady. Rhythmic. Each page sliding through. Each detail duplicated. Because one copy is information. More than one is protection. I took the stack when he handed it back. Neatly aligned. Perfectly clear. Thank you, I said. Back in the car, I placed the folder beside me. Not in my bag. Not hidden. Visible. Because I wasn't hiding anything anymore. That evening, I chose what to wear. Simple. Clean. Nothing new. Nothing that tried too hard. A soft gray sweater. Dark slacks. The same kind of outfit I had worn 100 times before. Because this wasn't about appearance. It was about presence. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment. Not adjusting. Not questioning. Just looking. They see someone they can manage, I said quietly. A pause. Then, they're about to be wrong. Sunday came quietly. No nerves. No hesitation. I picked up the folder before leaving. Held it for a moment. Not tight. Not loose. Just enough. The drive to David's house felt shorter than usual. Or maybe, I just wasn't thinking about the distance anymore. I pulled into the driveway. The house looked warm. Inviting. Lights on. Voices inside. From the outside. It looked like family. I stepped out of the car. Closed the door. And for a moment, I just stood there. Because this was the stage. Everything that had happened. Every quiet move. Every careful step. It all led here. I walked to the front door and knocked. Claire opened it. Of course she did. Her smile was back. Polished. Perfect. I'm so glad you came, she said warmly. I nodded. Stepped inside. The room was full. More people than I expected. Family. Relatives. Even a few people I hadn't seen in years. Interesting. They weren't just gathering. They were building an audience. Good. That made things easier. David stood near the table. Talking. Laughing. Until he saw me. His expression shifted. Just slightly. Mom, he said, walking over. You made it. I said I would, I replied. Simple. He nodded. But his eyes. They were searching. Looking for signs. Cracks. Emotion. But I gave him none. Because everything they needed to see would come later. At the table. At the right moment. Claire moved around the room. Hosting. Smiling. Controlling the flow. But I noticed something else now. The way she checked the room. The way her eyes landed on me. Just a second longer than before. She felt it. The shift. Good. Dinner was served. Everyone took their seats. Conversations filled the air. Light. Casual. But underneath, there was something else. Tension. Not loud. Not obvious. But present. Waiting. I sat quietly. Listened. Watched. Because timing was everything. And when the moment came, when the room settled just enough, When the noise softened, I would speak. Not loudly, not emotionally, just once. One sentence. And this time, no one in that room would be able to ignore it. Dinner moved the way these things always do. Slow at first. Careful. Polite. Plates passed from hand to hand. Glasses filled. Small conversations scattered across the table. Someone asked about the weather. Someone else mentioned a recent trip. Laughter came and went in short bursts. From the outside, it looked normal, but I could feel it. Underneath everything. The tension. Not mine. Theirs. Because every few minutes, someone glanced at me. Quick. Subtle. David more than anyone. He tried to stay engaged in conversation. Tried to laugh at the right moments. But his eyes kept returning. Checking. Measuring. Waiting. Claire was quieter. Not silent. But controlled. She watched the room. Managed it. Redirected conversations when they drifted too far. Kept everything balanced. But every time her gaze crossed mine, it lingered. Just a second longer. She was calculating. Good. That meant she wasn't certain anymore. And uncertainty changes everything. I ate slowly. Not because I was hungry, but because I wasn't in a hurry. This moment had to be exact. Not early. Not late. Exact. Halfway through dinner, David cleared his throat. Not loudly. Just enough to shift the room. I wanted to say something, he began. There it was. I didn't look at him right away. Just set my fork down. Folded my napkin. Gave him the space he thought he needed. We've been talking about some changes, he continued. About the house. About what's best moving forward. The room grew quieter. Not silent, but close. People listened. Some leaned in slightly. They didn't know the full story, but they felt it. Mom has done so much for all of us, he added. And we want to make sure she's taken care of. Taken care of. I almost smiled. Claire nodded gently beside him. Supporting. Reinforcing. We're just trying to make things easier, she said. Easier. The same word. Again. I lifted my eyes. Finally looked at them. Both of them. Standing there. Confident. Composed. Still believing they were in control. This isn't about taking anything, David added quickly. It's about planning for the future. Planning. Yes. It was. Just not the way he thought. I reached down beside my chair. Picked up the folder. Small movement. Quiet. But it changed something. Claire saw it first. Her expression didn't break. But it shifted. Just enough. David noticed a second later. His voice slowed. Mom. I stood up. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just stood. The room followed. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused midair. Because something had changed. Not loudly. But completely. I held the folder in my hands. Light. Simple. And then, I spoke. Not fast. Not slow. Clear. The house was never meant to be transferred without full consent and full awareness. Silence. Not the kind that fades quickly. The kind that settles. Heavy. David didn't speak. Claire didn't move. The room froze. I continued. Same tone. Same pace. The original agreement included protections. Conditions. Requirements that were removed. Before I signed anything. A breath. Small. Measured. And the witness listed on that document. I paused. Just long enough. Was never present when I signed it. That was it. One sentence. But it carried everything. The truth. The detail. The weight. And the room. Felt it. David's face changed first. Not anger. Not denial. Something else. Realization. Claire's reaction was smaller. But sharper. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. Just slightly. Because she understood immediately. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was exposure. Someone across the table shifted in their seat. Another set their glass down slowly. No one spoke. Because no one knew what to say. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. I placed the folder gently on the table. Not pushed. Not dropped. Just set down. Within reach. Visible. Undeniable. David looked at it. Then at me. His mouth opened slightly. Closed. Words didn't come. Claire recovered first. Of course she did. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice calm but tighter now. Those documents were handled professionally. No, I said. One word. Quiet. Final. And that stopped her. Because this time, there was no room to guide the conversation. No space to reshape it. The truth had already settled. And everyone in that room felt it. I looked around the table. At the faces. The reactions. The silence. They thought this was finished, I said softly. A pause. It isn't. And this time, no one questioned it. No one interrupted. Because now, they understood exactly what that meant. No one moved. Not right away. The room stayed exactly as it was. Frozen in that moment. The weight of what I said didn't explode. It didn't create chaos. It settled. Slow. Heavy. Unavoidable. David was the first to react. But not the way I expected. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stepped back. A small movement. Barely noticeable. But it told me everything. Because that wasn't confidence. That was distance. Mom, he started. His voice wasn't steady anymore. There has to be some mistake. Mistake. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time that night, I saw it clearly. He wasn't leading this. He was following. I thought you understood everything, he added. Thought. Not knew. Thought. I understand exactly what I signed, I said calmly. A pause. Then, and what I didn't. That stopped him. Not because the words were loud, but because they were precise. Claire stepped in again. Of course she did. She moved slightly closer to David. Not touching him, but positioning herself. Let's not do this here, she said softly. There it was. Control. She wanted to move the conversation. Contain it. Reduce the audience. No, I replied. Same tone. Same calm. This is exactly where we do it. Silence again. But different this time. Tighter. More focused. Because now, everyone was paying attention. Not casually. Not politely. Intently. Claire's smile returned. But thinner now. Less natural. If there's something you're concerned about, she said, we can sit down privately and go through everything step by step. Step by step. The same method she used before. Guide. Control. Redirect. Not this time. I already did, I said. Simple. Clear. Her eyes locked onto mine. Searching. Calculating. How, she asked. One word. But it carried tension. By reading what I signed, I replied. A pause. Then, and comparing it to what existed before. That was the shift. Small. But final. Because now, she knew. Not just that I questioned it, but that I understood it. Completely. David ran a hand through his hair. A nervous habit he hadn't outgrown. This doesn't make sense, he said. Everything was done legally. Legally. I nodded. Yes, I said. Carefully. Another pause. Which is why the missing clause matters. The room reacted to that. Subtle. But real. A few heads turned. Someone shifted in their seat. Because now, this wasn't just family tension. This was something else. Something structured. Something serious. Claire's voice lowered. What clause, she asked. Careful. But not as steady as before. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the folder. Slowly. Pulled out the documents. Placed them on the table. One by one. Original. Then transfer. Side by side. No explanation. No performance. Just evidence. The room leaned in. Not dramatically, but enough. Because paper makes things real. David looked down at the pages. Then back at me. I don't understand, he said. And this time, I believed him. You weren't supposed to, I replied. His expression shifted. Confusion. Then something else. Something closer to doubt. Claire stepped forward slightly. Her hand moved toward the papers, then stopped. Because touching them would mean acknowledging them. Instead, she looked at me. This doesn't change anything, she said. There it was. Not denial. Reframing. Trying to hold the ground. It changes everything, I said. No pause. No hesitation. Because it did. And she knew it. The room felt different now. Not frozen. Awake. Watching. Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. Another leaned back, arms crossing slowly. The energy had shifted. From passive to observant. From polite to aware. David looked between us. Back and forth. Trying to catch up. Trying to understand where control had slipped. Claire, he said quietly. But he didn't finish the sentence. Because now, he wasn't sure. Not about her. Not about me. Not about anything. And that uncertainty. That was new. I closed the folder gently. Not to end the conversation. But to mark it. This isn't about misunderstanding, I said. My voice remained steady. This is about what was removed before I was asked to sign. Another pause. And why? No one interrupted. No one argued. Because now, they weren't just listening. They were thinking. And thinking breaks control. Claire's posture changed again. Less open. More contained. Because the room was no longer hers. And she felt it. I looked at David one more time. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Just clarity. You should have asked me, I said. Simple. But it landed harder than anything else. Because beneath everything, that was the truth. He looked down. Didn't answer. Couldn't. And in that moment, everything they built started to come apart. Not loudly, but completely. Because once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. And now, it was everywhere. No one returned to their food. Not after that. Plates sat untouched. Glasses remained half full. Because the room had changed. Not in appearance. Everything still looked the same. But the weight of it was different. David stayed where he was. Standing. Not sitting. Like he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. Claire, on the other hand, adjusted. Of course she did. She straightened her posture. Smoothed her expression. And then, she smiled again. Not the same smile. Not the polished one from before. This one was tighter. More controlled. All right, she said calmly. Let's take a step back. Step back. She was trying to reset the room. Bring it back under her control. Clearly there's been some confusion about older documents, she continued. But what matters is what's legally binding now. Legally binding. She was shifting the ground. Moving away from intention and into technicality. A common move, but not a strong one. Not anymore. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. Because sometimes, the more someone explains, the more they reveal. We followed the proper process, she added. Everything was reviewed, signed, and witnessed. Witnessed. There it was again. That word. I tilted my head slightly. Not challenging. Not aggressive. Just acknowledging. And the clause? I asked. Simple. Direct. Her smile held. But only just. That clause is no longer relevant, she replied smoothly. It was part of an earlier version of the agreement. Earlier version. Interesting. I nodded slowly. Then it should still exist in the record, I said. A pause. Short, but visible. Because she knew. I wasn't guessing. I was confirming. David looked between us again. This is getting complicated, he said quietly. No one answered him. Because now, he wasn't leading anything. He was catching up. Claire stepped closer to the table. Closer to the documents. This time, she picked them up. Carefully. Not flipping through them quickly. Not dismissing them. Reading. Because now, she had to. The room watched. Every movement. Every shift. Even the smallest detail mattered. And then, it happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. But clear. Her fingers paused on one page. Just for a second. But that second was enough. David saw it. I saw it. And so did everyone else. Because hesitation speaks. You said this was standard, I said softly. Not accusing. Not pressing. Just reminding. Claire looked up. Her expression didn't break. But something behind it did. This doesn't prove anything, she said. But her voice was different now. Less certain. Because she knew. Not just that the documents existed, but that the room was no longer hers to manage. This proves enough, I replied. Quiet. Steady. And if it doesn't, a pause. It will. That landed. Not as a threat. As a fact. Someone at the table shifted again. Another leaned forward slightly. Because now, they understood. This wasn't over. Not even close. David sat down slowly. For the first time since this started. His hands rested on the table. Flat. Still. Claire, he said again. But this time, there was something different in his voice. Not certainty. Not support. Doubt. Clear. Unmistakable. She heard it. Of course she did. And for the first time, she didn't respond immediately. Because she didn't have control anymore. Not of him. Not of the room. Not of the story. I watched them both. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Just clarity. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about truth. And truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be seen. I reached forward and closed the folder. Slowly. Deliberately. The sound was soft. But it marked something. An ending. Or maybe a beginning. I won't argue this tonight, I said. Calm. Measured. But it will be addressed. No one interrupted. No one disagreed. Because now, there was nothing left to argue. Only what came next. I stood up. Not waiting for permission. Not asking for agreement. Just standing. And that alone shifted the room again. Because movement means decision. I think that's enough for today, I said. Simple. Final. David didn't stop me. Claire didn't respond. No one did. Because now, they understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't something they could manage. This wasn't something they could guide. And it definitely wasn't something they could finish quietly. I picked up my coat. Moved toward the door. Each step steady, unhurried. Behind me, the room stayed silent. Not frozen anymore. Just thinking, processing. And that was exactly where I needed them. Because once people start thinking, they start asking questions. And questions have a way of breaking things open. I reached the door, paused, not to look back, just to speak. One more thing, I said. My voice carried just enough. Clear. If anything else has been changed, a pause. Now would be the time to remember. Silence. Deep. Because that wasn't a question. It was a warning. I opened the door, stepped outside, and as it closed behind me, I knew this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about everything they thought they had secured, and everything they were about to lose. The night air felt colder than it should have. Not sharp, not bitter, just clear. I walked to my car without rushing. The sound of the door behind me still lingered in my ears. That soft click. Final. For a moment, I stood there beside the driver's door, hands resting lightly against the roof. Breathing. Not to calm down. I wasn't upset. To settle. Because something had shifted tonight. Not just in that room. In me. I got in, closed the door, and sat in silence. No music. No engine. Just stillness. They finally heard me, I said quietly. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I fought. But because I didn't. Because I chose my moment. And I didn't waste it. I started the car and drove home. The streets were empty. Streetlights stretching long across the pavement. Everything felt slower. Not heavy. Not tired. Just finished. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly the same as it always had. Unmoved. Unchanged. Waiting. I stepped inside. Closed the door behind me. And for the first time since this began, the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt mine. I set my coat down. Placed the folder back on the desk. Not hidden. Not locked away. Just where it belonged. Because I didn't need to hold on to it tightly anymore. The truth had already done its work. I walked into the living room and sat down slowly. The same chair. The same light. Thomas's photograph still resting across from me. I looked at it for a long moment. They tried to take it, I said softly. A pause. But they didn't understand what it was. Because it was never just a house. It was time, memory, effort. And those things don't transfer with a signature. The next morning came quietly. Sunlight through the curtains. The same as always. But everything felt different. Not because something had been restored, but because something had been revealed. Around noon, the phone rang. I already knew who it was. David. I let it ring once. Then answered. Mom, he said. His voice had changed. Not controlled. Not confident. Real. We need to talk. I didn't respond immediately. Because now, I chose the pace. Yes, I said. We do. A pause. I didn't know, he added. There it was. The truth he could offer. Not everything. Not enough. But something. I believe you, I said. And I did. Because I had already seen it. The hesitation. The distance. He wasn't the architect. But he was still part of it. That doesn't change what happened, I continued. Quiet. Clear. I know, he said. Another pause. Longer this time. What happens now, he asked. I looked around the room. At everything we had built. Everything they thought they had secured. And everything that had shifted. Now, I said slowly, we fix it. Not anger. Not punishment. Just correction. Because that's what this was always about. Not revenge. Truth. The days that followed weren't loud. No arguments. No scenes. Just meetings. Conversations. Documents reviewed again. Properly this time. And one by one, things were undone. The transfer reversed. The original terms restored. Not because I demanded it, but because they couldn't deny it. Not anymore. Claire stayed quiet through most of it. Careful. Measured. But different. Because now, she wasn't leading. She was responding. And that changed everything. The house remained where it always had been. With me. Not as something I held on to, but as something that had been returned to its truth. Weeks later, I sat in the garden. The roses fully in bloom. Soft. Open. Exactly as Thomas said they would be. They don't bloom overnight. I smiled faintly. No, they don't. Neither does clarity. That takes time. Patience. And the willingness to see things as they are. Not as we hope them to be. I leaned back slightly, letting the sun rest against my face. They thought they could take everything, I said quietly. A pause. They were wrong. Because what I gave was never weakness. It was trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't disappear. It reveals. Reveals who people are, what they value, and what they're willing to risk to get it. I looked back at the house, standing steady behind me, unchanged, but not untouched, because now, it held something more than memory. It held truth, and truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs one moment, one sentence, to stop everything, and remind everyone in the room exactly who they were dealing with.